Hi, and welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this show, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And I'm pleased to welcome again for his second appearance on the Power Hungry Podcast, my friend, Dr. Chris Keefer. Chris, welcome back to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Robert, it's a special honor to be back. I had a great time on our first episode, so thanks for being charitable with me.
No problem. I ask guests to introduce themselves. You've been on once, but you have to introduce yourself again. Go tell us.
I'll keep it brief.
Who are you? Yeah, sure.
I'm a Canadian emergency medicine room physician. You always talk about your family, so I'm going to borrow from you there as well, Robert. I have a beautiful 3-year-old boy. I am passionate about health, environment, climate. And as a result, I'm a nuclear energy advocate in a variety of forms, which we can get into.
Good. Well, so you've been at COP26 in Glasgow. I want to talk about that. But more immediately, I want to talk about what's happened just in the last few days where Google, in its finite wisdom, told you they're not going to take ads for the Decouple podcast. What is going on here?
Robert, it's a really bizarre situation. Decouple, we're actually now Decouple Media.
Okay.
We kind of make this stuff up as you go along, right? I say that a little bit facetiously, but we've launched kind of a beyond the podcast, something called Decouple Studios, which is hosted by a good friend of mine and really intelligent filmmaker and videographer, Jesse Freeston, creating kind of mid-length content, 5 to 10 minute stuff that he's hosting and bringing a really great angle to. And so for that, that's a YouTube style platform, and it's really important to, have a distribution plan. As you know, with podcasts, word of mouth, it spreads around, you get some reviews. We're always looking for ways to grow our audiences, no doubt. But on YouTube, it's really important to, do some ad buys and get the podcast growing or get that part of it growing. So we went through that basic application. It's very simple, a little bit of information, credit card details, that kind of thing. And we got a message back saying that we'd been flagged and that, we could appeal the decision. And there was no rationale given. It's typical sort of algorithm stuff. So I didn't think much of it. I was like, well, there must be a glitch in the matrix. So, let me fill in this appeal form. Again, there wasn't much to respond to because it wasn't like you are guilty of this specific, social media code violation. But I just got a email back today saying that, after reviewing your case, taking your feedback into consideration, which was like 3 or 4 lines of mumbo jumbo, we've confirmed that your account was and still is in violation of our Google Ads policies. They don't say what they were, what policy was violated. As such, we will not be reactivating your account. Please don't create new Google Ads accounts, as these will be suspended as well. When we suspend a Google Ads account, the suspension applies to the account owner and any current or future linked Google Ads accounts. So it's just draconian right across the board. Just to be very clear, the podcast is available, but I can't do anything with it to help distribute it, basically.
And there's no explanation of what the policy is or what you're in violation of.
Zero. We're left guessing.
Is Orwellian the right word here? So you're trying to tangle with one of the massive media corporation, and you don't know what to, where even to start, or there's no. We've looked at your appeal and you're screwed. I've tried to get Twitter to verify my account now twice, turned down immediately twice. I'm kind of going to, I think I'm just going to try a third time and then say, well, how do you do this?
There's crazy stuff. As you know, social media has been this amplifier for some pretty horrific events, occasions, ideologies, ways of seeing the world. The way that the Rohingya massacre played out, partially on a Facebook platform in terms of its amplification, but this ease of censorship, which, if it's ideologically convenient to someone, they might be tempted to say, yeah, we should have more of these controls on our platforms, but it can really bite you in the ass. I've never been someone to call for censorship of anybody. I think we need to have a battle of ideas. I don't think we all need to get along, but we need to put the ideas out there and see which ones stick.
But you're not doing anything that's that. Where's the controversy here? You're not misstating anything. You're not making things up. There's no conspiracy. You're not promoting some conspiracy here. It just seems that this is extraordinarily arbitrary.
I'm guessing that it may have to do with vocal complaints from some people, not even necessarily powerful people, but I imagine there's opportunities to flag content, right? As a user of said content.
Right.
And I think the algorithms are probably quite sensitive to that. And so that's likely what's happened. But again, I'm an emergency room physician working on, science-based material inviting on some of the smartest, most intelligent, guests from around the world. We're talking about, I guess, a controversial taboo topic, which is, largely nuclear energy amongst some other topics. But yeah, it's pretty stunning. I'll get back to you with an update. I do have a plan. I don't go down easy. I'm pretty sure we're going to make this all work out, but yeah, I don't want to dwell on it too much. I'm not feeling like a horrible victim of
sure. But at the same time, it is one of the indicators, and I haven't had this happen to me. I mean, look, I've had people try and cancel me, and they attack me for what some of the things I've said and done. Well, okay, well that's fine, but you should have a rationale for it. If there's something that is there that is clearly that you have some basis, then state it. But anyway, let's go on and talk about COP26 because I know you went over there. Tell me there are a lot of things that I want to talk about with regard to what happened in Glasgow, but what was your overall takeaway? I mean, how many days were you there, and what did you leave with?
Sure. Yeah. So I was there for about 9 days. And yeah, I think it's useful just to sort of paint the scene for you a little bit. It's occurring in Glasgow, which is the home of James Watt, who unleashed the Industrial Revolution by putting a little finesse into the steam engine, draining those coal mines, and unleashed this era of prosperity, but also now with the side effect of climate change. So it's kind of a poetic location. There's a statue of James Watt that I just kind of stood at the bottom of in awe, thinking about the historic significance of this man. It's in this. It had been a very industrial city, obviously. And there's this big conference happening in, I believe it's a converted soccer stadium area under heavy security. There's a blue zone, which is for government figures, media, NGOs that are approved. And I was lucky to get access to that zone. There's a green zone, which is sort of protest play area, quite far removed, which I didn't end up getting to. And then within the city, there were several large demonstrations. There was a Fridays for Future climate strike march, and then a larger march on the Saturday taking place in almost horizontal sleeting rain and attracting about 100,000 people. So I didn't have tickets for the first week. So I was mostly in the city at those climate marches, participating a little more in civil society. And then we got into the blue zone itself. And that's just maybe it's a bit like the World Expo of climate. There's country pavilions and NGO pavilions, and you can kind of tour large sections of the world, like Africa and Asia and Europe. Not every country is represented, and it's very curious to sort of my hypotheses as to why that is. Huge contingent of African countries. Canada, for instance, didn't have a pavilion, but Sierra Leone did. And I mean, clearly there's a bit of a, energy return and energy invested calculation going on here in terms of establishing trade, aid relationships and relationships with NGOs at such an important event. So some, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates had just absolutely enormous decked out pavilions. Each pavilion said something about the country that housed it and their thoughts about energy and climate. So it was just a fascinating, what do you call it? Like a kind of like an art gallery, really. Of performance art. Well,
tell me about Sierra Leone, because I wrote a piece about the deadly explosion on November 5th, if memory serves, where now the death toll from that fuel tanker explosion is 144 people burned alive in Freetown.
Wow.
Capturing fuel from an overturned fuel tanker. What was Sierra Leone's, what was their exhibit?
It was I'd say it's like a moderately sized exhibit. It was mostly just kind of, a desk behind which some people were speaking. I have to confess, I didn't spend a lot of time at that pavilion, but
sure.
As I was mentioning, Jesse Freeston's, when he's hosting Decouple Studios, he lapel mic'd up a South African woman named Princey Mthamini.
Sure.
And a Peruvian American, Shirley Rodriguez, and they actually kind of toured around Africa talking about issues of energy poverty. And that little piece your listeners should check out. It's called "Can African Poverty Be a Climate Solution?" A bit of a rhetorical question there, but I think your audience would like it. But I'll dodge a little bit the Sierra Leone question because I didn't spend enough time at that pavilion.
And that's on decouplepodcast.org, which is your new website that you've just now populating as well.
That's the old website. It's on YouTube at our Decouple YouTube channel, which we can't advertise.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Right. Okay.
So word of mouth. We can word of mouth, Robert. So I appreciate that.
That's free. We can't stifle the word of mouth.
Yeah.
Well, so your takeaway. I know you laid out kind of the general thing, and I'm going to be clear with you. I've watched these COP meetings for a long time, and my sense of it is and I don't know if it's cynical or just realistic, is that A lot of people go. There's a lot of rhetoric before. There's a lot of rhetoric during, and then in the last hour, oh, we finally hammered out agreement, and the agreement invariably is, well, we're going to get real serious the next time. And am I wrong in my cynicism or my assessment here?
Not at all. Not at all. And I mean, there have been COPs, I believe in Copenhagen. I forget which number. I was at 26, but several COPs ago, things fell apart. I think particularly because the Chinese said, listen, there's something called differential responsibility. It's your guys' fault. You industrialize first. And so that led to there not actually being any agreement. But most COPs, there is an agreement. Obviously, Paris was one of the more famous ones, the most ambitious ones. I didn't pay so much attention to the formal proceedings themselves. There was a big controversy about whether there was going to be a coal phase out or a coal phase down. And countries like India, who rely heavily on coal, were saying, meh. So I was much more interested in sort of the civil society areas and looking at the various pavilions. It was really fascinating. Someone who's quite obsessed with nuclear energy, walking around the pavilions. The Russian pavilion was pretty interesting. It was Rosatom, basically. I was like, is this the country or the company? It was all nuclear. And it was just extraordinary because in the rest of the entire, representation of all the countries in the world, there was scarcely a mention of nuclear. And they had a mock-up of a VVER reactor and an idealized city nearby. And, it was all about the power of the atom. It was very interesting. And every talk was about that. And I think it makes sense as well. They're looking for customers as well. They're the number one exporter of nuclear energy around the world. And they're not afraid to troll the world a little bit and say, I don't even call it trolling, right? Just to be like, actually, this is the effective deep decarbonization tool. That's the only proven one that really works.
And given the European energy crisis, this is their ultimate opportunity, right? I mean, they trolled him on Twitter a few weeks ago saying something like, well, these gas prices, maybe they suggest you need a little nuclear over there. Hey, Europe.
Totally.
I mean, it was something, I'm paraphrasing, but that was what the gist of it, no?
And I mean, I compare that to France, which it was, the aesthetic choices of the French pavilion were unbelievable. It was chipboard plywood floors, chipboard plywood, little box seats. And on the wall, I kid you not, Robert, it says, "Make the planet great again." #. I don't know who designed this pavilion.
Make the planet great again?
# make the planet great again. And this was very interesting because clearly the people that planned the French pavilion did so before Macron had his big moment of discovery and pride in French innovation. I think Schellenberger was on my podcast recently talking about that video that the French government put out recently, this pivot, réinventer le nucléaire, this pivot back to nuclear energy, this commitment to build 6 new large-scale pressurized water reactors, 6 EPRs, and to work on an SMR for export. That had percolated through to the representatives of the delegation, and I got to do a very interesting interview with one of them. But in terms of the aesthetics of the pavilions, there was not a mention of nuclear energy in France. You'd think it was more of a Canadian pavilion because it was just looked like a bunch of lumber, like really shitty put together plywood. It was, and 2x4s. It was bizarre, Robert. It was bizarre. The other favorite pavilion.
That is interesting. Your idea though about the, what does the exhibit say about the country that's putting the exhibit there, right? What is the message that they're putting forward? And it's funny that our country is about chipboard or
it didn't fit. It didn't fit. Everyone's head was spinning. And then just to give you a sense, I guess, of like more of the civil society NGO participation, right across from the Russians, there's this big pavilion focused on the issue of methane as a global warming gas. Mm-hmm. I kid you not. The large kind of lettering title of the booth was called "The Methane Moment." And so we were all joking about how it'd be important not to have any methane moments during our time covering this conference. So
or in the elevator. Yeah, you don't want a methane moment in the elevator. Yeah, that would be bad.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, so what else did you take away? You're giving us kind of a sketch of your visual sketch of, but what was the mood? There's been a lot of talk around climate, but the official declarations to me didn't amount to anything. It was there, but it seemed that the pro-nuclear forces it turned out in Glasgow more in my opinion, what I saw or what I saw reported, maybe more than any of the other COPs. I don't know.
Absolutely.
I didn't go to any of those. So tell me about that part of it.
Yeah, no, apparently, this was my first COP, but apparently there's just been an absolute groundswell and a shift here. And I don't want to paint in overly dramatic terms, but the anti-nuclear folks have controlled the discourse, with an iron fist. And just the fact that we're breaking through and pro-nuclear messages are being received and they're getting out into the media or policymakers are talking about them means that the dam has burst. And, I don't want to say we've won already, but that is a huge, huge victory, that now the discourse is open and there are, opposing sides and we can have conversations. And I think the logic is very much on our side. The evidence is very much on our side. So, that's from something as simple as the large demonstrations outside of the conference, the Fridays for Future March and the big NGO march, where, Team Nuclear was there in force. We had a bunch of Melty the Polar Bears, a lot of signs, a megaphone, pamphlets. In previous COPs, people have been violently assaulted. They have been kicked out of the marches, these climate marches. Nuclear is not welcome. We did have one member of our team who was, I don't want to sort of like overpaint things, but she had her sign ripped from her and taken from her, and she was pushed a little bit. Of course, it was the smallest woman in our delegation. But I would say just by our presence there, we talked a lot with, there's a lot of labor unions marching, and I brought my, nuclear workers or climate heroes banner and gave it to the GMB union members. And they said, oh, sure, we'll hold this. We've got nuclear workers in our delegation. So that was kind of fun. Speaking of free speech, there was a very interesting number of interactions I had with actually the same two Scottish police. And they came up to me at the first day of demonstrations. They said, "Hey, listen, like if the anti-nuclear people you get in your face or they're making you uncomfortable, please leave."
So you don't deserve to be here, but they do.
And I said, I don't know where I'm from. We say, to protect and serve. So if we're being assaulted or, that's actually your role to come in and to protect and diffuse that. And he's like, well, there's a lot of stuff to do here. And I'm like, well, if you're really worried about us, then, and it happened the second day as well. I said, hey, didn't I come and talk to you yesterday? And I said, yeah, absolutely. And it was, we have it all on camera. It was a pretty funny interaction. We're going to be putting more stuff out on COP. We're just under-resourced for the amount of footage that we captured. But that stuff is, I think, on the way out. At the previous COP in Poland, the police actually made the nuclear delegation leave. And so it's a breakthrough moment, I think, in terms of the conversation shifting. And I had a very interesting moment with my own government and our own new environment minister, which was a real sort of example of that as well. I don't know if you want to get into that now or
right, sure. It was Stephen Guilbeault, right? He's the Minister of Environment and Climate Change in the Trudeau government. I think he just got that job in October, right? And so you ran into him, or was this an ambush? Did you know where he was going to be and plan this out? How did it work? How did it? A little of both.
For context, our very opportunistic government was governing under a minority, so they were propped up by another party in our democratic system. And COVID was kind of getting better in the summer, and they thought there was an opportunity to score a majority. So they threw an election, and they ended up getting almost the exact same seat count. Basically nothing changed except for a bunch of Canadians got pissed off that we spent more than $500 million on a useless election as another COVID wave washed over us, right? So it resulted in cabinet shuffles as new governments do. And as an attempt to sort of win support in a certain region of the country, he gave this guy this portfolio. And this isn't just any old gentleman. He's a prominent environmentalist. He was involved with communications at Greenpeace Canada and internationally for 10 years, founded his own NGO, environmental NGO. He actually once rappelled off of what used to be the tallest tower in the world, the CN Tower, with a big climate banner and got a year of probation and a $50,000 fine. So he's got a real history of activism. He went a little corporate in the last 10 years before his appointment, worked for a group called Cycle Capital. And you're going to love this. They're a sort of green energy investment firm. I did a bit of digging on them. And one of their big investments was in a product called AirTech, and it makes biocoal. Do you know what biocoal is?
I don't know.
It's this revolutionary new technology. It's going to blow your mind. You've written a lot about energy, right, Robert?
A bit.
So wait for this. It involves taking wood biomass, okay, heating it up in a no oxygen environment and making biocoal.
That's called charcoal.
Exactly. So, I mean, okay. These titans of green industry, funding, financing, I mean, that was one of their things they're really proud of. They had a big press release about it. I'm not sure how involved Stephen Guilbeault was in that particular investment, but this is the kind of activities this man was involved with. I'm glad you were also scratching your head as I described that, because I couldn't believe my eyes when I wrote it. This is a green investment making charcoal. I mean, I think Schellenberger wrote about that a lot in terms of its impacts on forests. And actually, when our colleagues were touring the African countries, they were talking with the forestry ministry, and they said, tell us about the forest. And they said, we need energy. Right. If we have energy, we're going to stop cutting down these forests and turning them into charcoal. So pretty ironic.
We need propane and butane. But so so then fast forward to your talk with Guilbeault, because you recorded it and you were on Shane Ganam's podcast recently talking about this. So what did you ask him, and what did he say?
Well, there's a bit of a backstory, if you don't mind me going into it. I think it's important. So about 3 weeks ago, I was invited up to the largest operating nuclear plant in the world, which is in my backyard in Ontario here. It's called Bruce Power. And I was invited by a number of nuclear labor unions. There's about 3 or 4 of them who are inviting other members of the labor movement and our left-wing political party to come up and do a tour of the plant and talk labor issues. And I mean, you've been to Indian Point, you've been to communities around nuclear plants. I mean, I won't speak for you in terms of your experiences, but these are places with thousands and thousands of high skilled trades jobs, machinists, millwrights, pipe fitters, boiler makers, etc., who are working in these intergenerational jobs alongside STEM professionals, healthy communities. Anyway, so it was a really neat opportunity to be there. And I made some connections with some folks at the Canadian Labor Congress, and one of them happened to be going to COP. So we said we'd be in touch, and I messaged him, on day 3 or 4 while I was there. And he said, oh yeah, we should meet up. And then the minister's coming to the World Wildlife Fund Pavilion to make an announcement. I said, which minister? He says, Stephen Guilbeault. I said, can I come? He's like, sure. Anyway, so the name of the presentation, it was called Powering Through the Coal Phase Out with a Just Transition for Workers, right? Yeah. And I did, full disclosure, I was there, with the Decouple podcast doing media. So I did get myself lapel mic'd. My colleague, Jesse Freeston, had the camera going, and I was hoping to ask a question at the end of the presentation. But again, the name of this presentation, Powering Through the Coal Phase Out, a Just Transition. Mr. Guilbeault, again, at every opportunity he's had, has opposed nuclear energy, made statements against it, fought to have the Gentilly CANDU reactor shut down in Quebec, tried to have our beloved Pickering plant closed here. The irony of all that is that in Ontario, nuclear energy provided 90% of the power to phase out coal in what has been called the greatest greenhouse gas reductions measure in North America, in North American history, right? And those coal workers got new jobs in nuclear plants and had a just transition, right? And this man is vehemently opposed to nuclear energy any chance that he gets, right? So it was a typical session, and I think this was very typical of the events in the COP Pavilion. The dignitaries would come in, they'd get prepped questions kind of passed off to them like a little softball, and then they would leave before the public had any chance to interact. And I said, no, I'm not gonna let that happen. And my filmmaker buddy sent me a little text saying, yeah, that's what's about to happen. So Mr. Guilbeault was excused, kind of midway into the thing after he answered his questions, got very important work to do. So I dashed for the door and I opened it for him very politely. And as he stepped through, I said, may I have a moment of your time? And it was just this kind of paleo psychology thing of, you make a gesture to someone, they feel compelled to make a gesture back. I think that there'd be no other way I would have gotten a moment of his time. But I managed to confront him on this issue, on whether his anti-nuclear record and views would cloud his judgment in the light that all 4 principal decarbonization pathways of the IPCC call for nuclear energy, and that we did a coal phase out and had a just transition in Ontario. And he should be damn proud of that and be bragging about that and be, really exporting Canada's success story around the world. He dodged the question. And we can talk a bit more about that, but I'm conscious that I've been on a bit of a diatribe here, Robert. I'm pretty passionate about this.
No, I understand it, but to me, what's interesting about that, and I guess when I think about where Canada is, particularly relative to the United States, you have a reactor that is effectively your national champion, the CANDU design, right? Using heavy water, right? So, and it's one that's been proven. You've had no accidents with it. I was just looking up Bruce. I didn't realize it's 6.5 gigawatts. I mean, the 8 reactors in one location. I knew Palo Verde here in the U.S., I think, is the largest one at, was it 4 or 5 gigawatts? But it's a massive, massive power station. But it just seems to me that your championing of the nuclear sector in Canada is intriguing to me in that regard, that if Canada were serious, it could be a challenger to Rosatom on the global scale, right? If it chose to be, in terms of exporting technology to other countries, particularly Africa, et cetera, that where they need nuclear technology as an alternative to coal. Does that rhyme with you in terms of how you kind of see
Well,
Canada in the global scheme now?
let's do a little thought exercise here, Robert. You
Okay,
up for
sure,
that?
go ahead.
So imagine you don't know anything about the CANDU, never heard about the reactor,
Okay,
and I'm going to pitch it to you as something that's brand new and doesn't exist yet. All right. So
Okay.
here's this reactor. Okay. We don't need to enrich uranium for it. So it's very accessible for countries that don't have that capacity. You can just dig this stuff out of the ground, mill it, and throw it in your reactor. Okay. You don't need heavy forging industry. So even if you're a smaller country without huge industrial capacity, or you're the US that has lost its heavy forging capacity, you can build this reactor in your own country. It's accessible to you in that regard. This is a very, very safe reactor. It's got multiple safety systems. It has a huge sort of thermal mass of water around it. And it's not one big core of fuel that can melt down. It's separate in all these little channels, right? So it's an inherently very safe reactor. And as a spin-off feature, this magical reactor I'm telling you about, it can produce medical isotopes. And it actually produces at just Bruce power enough medical isotopes to sterilize 40% of the world's single-use medical supplies. So I don't know if you've ever, been in hospital, Robert. I hope nothing recent, but anything that cannot be withstanding very high temperatures, basically anything that's not metal or glass, needs to be sterilized, right? And that happens with medical isotopes. And 40% of the world's masks, IV cannulas, endotracheal tubes, you name it. If it's made out of plastic in a hospital, it's been sterilized in that way. So this reactor type, Robert, can enable modern healthcare. Does that sound like a pretty cool, advanced, exciting design?
It's interesting because if I'm closing my eyes and thinking, okay, blank slate, like you said, I'm thinking, well, all these SMRs that are now being developed, that it has many of those same characteristics that
And
it
can burn thorium too.
So,
I mean, if you're a thorium bro, then yeah. So I mean, all this to point out that I mean, and I'm not a nuclear engineer, but I talk to a lot, and maybe I pretend I am one on TV or something. But there's a lot of exciting reactor concepts and a lot of advanced features. A lot of those concepts date back to the very early days of nuclear energy, when we actually had the regulatory environment where we could actually mess around and build things and see how they worked and whatnot. But nuclear. In terms of the West doing nuclear again, we suck at it, and we're so obsessed, I think, in terms of the Western industries, that a new design, a new innovation is going to bail us out and make nuclear great again, to echo the French there.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the real issue that I see at COP in terms of the discussions around nuclear. It was very, particularly not amongst the Russians. They were saying, yes, we will build out of EVERs, and even the French, they're saying we're going to build our EPRs. We're going to develop an SMR for export. But in terms of the Western nations, the UK, big announcement with Rolls-Royce, Canada, the US, very, very focused on SMR and advanced nuclear. And it's kind of understandable. I think, these companies are very well capitalized. There's a lot of sort of speculation. Maybe there'll be a breakout. They have some money to throw around, right? But, again, in terms of the likelihood of success for the West in building new reactors, we had that potential renaissance, at the time of so-called peak oil.
Sure.
And we had some fancy new designs. The AP1000, it was going to just click together like Lego. It was modular construction. The whole thing about the AP1000 is that it was going to be quick to build. Right. Didn't end up working out that way. So, my very basic and philosophy on this is that the Western nuclear industry needs to be very humble, and it needs to do something that it knows how to do. So here in Canada, we've been refurbishing our CANDUs, because every 30, 40 years, you need to retube them, right? You need to swap out the major components. And so Canada's largest infrastructure project has been refurbishing CANDU units. We've got a supply chain up and running. We have a very skilled workforce. We've got a regulator that understands this issue very well. In my mind, the humble, safe thing to do as an industry is to build some more CANDUs, right? Get the experience going, get the industry healthy, and then, do these spinoffs. And that's what Rosatom does. That's what China does. They have a basic reactor program, and then they start exploring some other stuff on the sides. But I find that we're sort of putting the cart before the horse and saying, we're going to pursue a lot of new novel things because they're not like those other girls. And maybe the public will approve it. So, well,
when you're talking about that, what comes to mind, Chris, is this issue of scale, right? And it's always about scale. And in my fourth book, Power Hungry, I said, well, what are the imperatives? What I call them the four imperatives: power, density, energy density, cost, and scale. And so I'm adamantly pro-nuclear, but when I look at the U.S. and I look at all the different technologies, and I've done many interviews about all these technologies that are in the development cycle, and they're waiting for NRC approval and permitting, and then you get that done, you still have to build them, and you have to build a bunch of them. And that industrial process, that industrial base is hard to build. It takes a long time, and it takes a ton of capital, and it takes a ton of patient capital. And so I guess your point about the Russian industry, you're obviously Canadian and know this a lot better than I do, but just that Russia could, if it wanted to, and if had the political will, really push this out into the international marketplace as the Russians are doing, and potentially contend, because it has, as you say, the supply chain and the ability to sell it as a safe alternative to coal at scale. And that to me is quite interesting, and it's something I hadn't really ever thought about until we're just talking about it now.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think obviously Russia's huge right now. I mean, I don't know if you heard about it, but and I don't think it was really announced as a part of a COP thing. China didn't have a pavilion. So I didn't learn as much about their positions, but just pre-COP, there was an announcement that they're doing a $440 billion investment in 150 gigawatts of nuclear over 15 years. So I'm calling this the Mesmer plan with Chinese characteristics. It's a pretty extraordinary investment in nuclear. I mean, China is a huge country. I mean, that'll give them the largest fleet in the world.
Probably 150 gigawatts and 450 billion in spending.
Yeah. So you run the math on that. I think it's around 3 or 4 billion a gigawatt,
yeah,
right?
Right. Per gigawatt.
And they have credibility on that. I think in terms of export, like I would love to see Canada export its technology. I think that's great for the economy. I tend to be a bit of a liberal, soft at heart person who says that, there is this kind of idea of carbon debt, and we can repay that carbon debt by, exporting our CANDU technology and helping other smaller countries use less fossil fuels or leapfrog certain fossil fuels that they can, so they can decarbonize, or so they can, have that stable, reliable electricity that they need to develop. But I do think but
isn't one of the problems though with CANDU is that you're talking about reactors that are 800 megawatts that for many locations, especially if we're talking about Africa, because I think, okay, so where would nuclear at scale really make the most difference? And it's going to be in Southern Asia and in Sub-Saharan Africa. But, a lot of these countries, Sierra Leone, we talked about before, 800 megawatts is just going to be too big.
No, absolutely. So there's
the potential that CANDU could be reduced down to 100 megawatts or 50 megawatts. But that's going to require a retooling, redesigning of the designs. No.
I mean, there is a CANDU SMR. Again, I mean, I'm not trying to be a CANDU salesman here. I think it's a great technology. I'm a proud Canadian. In terms of Canada being a nuclear export giant, I don't think that's going to happen. I think we have a moderate role to play there. I think we should pursue it. But countries like Russia are established. And China is obviously going to leap to the forefront because they can offer financing, right? Right. They can build you that reactor and you can pay it off in the next 30, 40 years. And while your country is being developed by the electricity it's producing. So, the idea that Western upstart reactor companies are going to be, powering Africa with SMRs that are, US designed, et cetera, I think is a little pie in the sky. I think China's going to fill in that void. They just built an SMR in Pakistan. And I think they're poised with their historic investment to be able to actually offer the financing to these poor countries, because all these countries want nuclear. Like when we did our little tour of Africa with Princey and Shirley, they're saying, we would love nuclear. I mean, we want energy. We don't really care what kind it is, but it'd be great if it was nuclear.
It's interesting you say that, because I say that many times. What we care about is power. We don't give a darn about energy. We don't care what goes in the gas tank. I'll put sawdust or coconut cream pie in the gas tank. If it makes, if I sit and press on the accelerator, that's what matters to me. This is the car going to go, or if I flip the switch. Well, it's interesting because what I hear you saying, Chris, is something I haven't heard you say before, but it's that you're adamantly pro-nuclear and passionate about it, and it comes through, right? This has been your life's work for the last several months or even years. But you just don't think that what I've heard you say is you don't think the West is going to play much of a role in the deployment of nuclear at scale in the global market.
I mean, I would like us to. I think that's going to take a real groundswell of a change in public support, and I think we're seeing that. And part of it is just pragmatics. It was very interesting. You had Mark Nelson on a little while ago. He's talked a lot about that history of electricity deregulation, energy deregulation in the UK under Thatcher. And you have this extraordinary return with this, I believe it's called the regulated asset base financing model, where investors can be paid out during the construction phase for their investment in nuclear, and it's anticipated that it will save something like $20 to $30 billion to the public over the life of their plants. Because as you remember, Hinkley Point, the price for it is about 2/3 interest. They're getting interest at 9 or 10%. That capital can be de-risked if we can set up these kind of investment environments that are friendly, such as this regulated asset base. And I just thought it was so ironic that was happening in the UK. The origin place of this kind of ultra deregulation,
right?
And now they're moving back to that model. Like when Edgardo Sepulveda was very influential in educating me on this, but when we were adding 5 or 6 or 7% capacity to the grid every single year, that happened within a certain regulatory environment,
right? And it was the same. And it was the same here in the U.S., which I think is one of the reasons why incremental additions of new nuclear in the U.S. are going to be so difficult, because our electricity consumption has been flat for 15 years. And meanwhile, we're adding a whole lot of new generation capacity. It's up 14% or so in the U.S., even though generation or total consumption has been flat. So we're adding a lot of capacity that's being underutilized. So the idea of adding yet more, well, where's it going to go and who's going to pay for it in particularly difficult market in the U.S., given that the demand isn't growing and you've got a very diffused ownership situation in the U.S., nearly 3,000 publicly owned utilities. It's very complex.
Regulated monopoly and regulated asset base that can pay out. You're right, though. I mean, there's not an increasing demand. There's the idea that there should be in the form of this electrify everything agenda, which I know you've have some serious critiques with, having had your grid fail you for a prolonged period. That's very understandable. And I mean, that's kind of been one of my lines recently, is if you want to electrify everything, then this needs to be ultra reliable electricity, right?
Right.
And
if
maybe
you
not
don't mind if we stop and just go back to that regulated model, because that's the part where, and I think Mark Nelson's points on this, I didn't really realize that the deregulation of the British electric market happened just a few years before the deregulation of the Texas market, and that then both places, both provinces, have a massive failure and within a few months of each other. But it goes back to the point that I've been making for a while, which is, no, this isn't just a market. This is a critical service, and you can't just let it go to the whim of the marketplace. The government needs a strong role here to make it happen.
Right.
And I guess that's the point about Russia and China, is that they have a strong role in the nuclear industry, and that's why it's thriving there. Am I making sense on that?
No, not at all. And I mean, I'm
not making sense.
I know you are. I think you are.
Okay.
I mean, I'm a creature. My origins are in the political left, but I had a really interesting discussion with Michael Schellenberger 2 or 3 episodes ago, and he was talking about how leftists kind of just look at capital as one big evil thing, and that there's different kinds of capital. And you mentioned this earlier. There's kind of a patient capital and maybe more of a profiteering, financialized vulture capital, right? And one profits off of highly volatile energy prices and real shocks and catastrophes, and the other likes stability, and it's a good partner for nuclear. And so there's models that are attractive to each form of capital. And so I think that's kind of really moderated my opinions. I do think there's a really strong role for government, and I do think that some investment should definitely be coming from government, but the government can do a lot to set up an environment that's good for that. Let's call it a good kind of capital that can be constructive, that can help, build up our country, build up prosperity. And fundamentally, I'm a real climate hawk, but I think adaptation is vital at this point. And that's going to require a lot of energy and reliable energy. Right. So, part 2 of this trip was heading over to Germany, to Berlin, for this last stand for nuclear to save the last German 6 reactors. And, I went to the belly of the beast in terms of, the country with the highest per capita spending on renewables. And it really, that I have I've not been afraid to be a bro, shall we say. I hate that terminology. If you raise the slightest criticism of renewable energy as a nuclear advocate, you're a nuclear bro. But it really had a profound impact on me being in Germany, particularly during a windless, cloudy week. And having interviewed the spokesperson of the German delegation about the hypocrisy of closing their nuclear and keeping their coal going, and preaching to the world that they should phase out coal, while coal was the number 1 source of generation on their grid this year. Right.
And that was Stefan Gabriel Haufe, I guess, was the interview that you have on your website. Again, my guest is Chris Keefer. He's the founder and host at Decouple Podcast. You can find him at decouplepodcast.org. He's also the founder of Doctors for Nuclear Energy, and don't know, a couple of other outfits that you've been busy. But I thought that the Germany issue is one that I wanted to talk about as well, because here's a country where they effectively are bottlenecked in terms of building new renewables. I mean, the backlash there, as in much of Europe, as in the United States, is you're seeing rural areas saying, we don't want your damn wind turbines, go take them somewhere else. And oh, by the way, we don't want your big high voltage transmission lines either, which is something that we saw the referendum on November 2nd in May, or November 2nd in Maine, forgive me, where 59% of the people who voted in Maine said we don't want high voltage transmission projects built in Maine, even though it's, Canadian hydro coming to Massachusetts. There's no way. So, but how did you had about a 20 or 30 minute conversation with Haufe? What was your takeaway? Because I mean, you clearly made him squirm in some regards. What was your takeaway there?
I mean, I looked at that interview as, it was a huge gotcha. I sort of gave him the rope to hang himself. I was looking forward to sort of chopping the interview up and providing it to our German allies who are organizing this demonstration to maybe use as promotions, just to say, hey, look what this guy's saying, right? And they said, this isn't controversial. I think to my audiences outside of Germany, it was pretty extraordinary and eye-opening, right? And I it wasn't easy to get an interview with the spokesperson and press secretary of the German delegation. I may have taken a few little liberties. We'd gone and interviewed actually one of your former guests, Richard Harrington, at the New York Climate Hub, and we'd gotten passes that said, New York Times Climate Hub. And I may or may not have mentioned that I had some affiliation, which I may or may not have with the New York Times. But it did earn me the confidence and get me this interview. And, I approached it very much. I wanted it to be a fair interview. I was, not being completely forthwith in terms of who I was or what group I was or what my allegiances are. But I didn't want to have a sort of dogmatic interview with him. So I really, gave him the chance to sort of sell Germany's vision. But it was interesting because, I started off by saying, like you've done this at a certain degree of sacrifice, being a first mover with renewable energy. But it must now be paying some dividends in terms of having been a first mover and owning a lot of the IP and things like that. And, the famous German vertically organized supply chains, like that must be bringing some good to Germany. He said it's been very expensive. And our solar panel companies all got offshore to China, so he had opportunities to brag, but I think the truth is just so barren that, it came across. But, I was challenging him on things like, again, the fact that Europe's having an extreme weather event this year. It's not hurricanes or cyclones. It's just that the wind isn't blowing very much. It may be part of a phenomenon called global stilling as the poles heat more quickly than the equator. We may be seeing mid-latitude winds just dropping off, and Europe's made a big gamble on this that might really kick them in the ass. But as a result, coal's the number one source of electricity on the grid, 27%, and they're phasing out their nuclear, about 8 gigawatts of nuclear in the next 6 or 7 months. And not doing anything about that coal until 2038. But what was really interesting was getting him to talk about, well, what's the plan once the coal's gone? How are you going to balance the intermittency? And I brought up Nord Stream. And he said, well, Germany is going to be climate neutral, carbon neutral by 2045. And so, people that are investing in this gas infrastructure, they really need to know that this is a short-term investment. That Nord Stream 2 is a short-term investment, or the new gas plants they're building right now are a short-term investment. I mean, there's a kind of, I'm not sure that it actually is that he is being dishonest. I think he's drank his own Kool-Aid. And I found that with a lot of the Germans I spoke to, both from the delegation and, in Germany at this demonstration, where I've never met people that were so frigid, cold, and closed off and just unwilling to engage. It was like, I don't know, I'm trying to think of the analogous topic of conversation you might bring up that would result in such revulsion. But it was a very interesting experience. I should say what was also fascinating was we were flying out of COP going to Berlin on the last day of COP, and so was most of the German delegation. We actually ended up surrounded on the plane by the German delegation. And Robert, we haven't had the pleasure to meet yet, but I'm 6'9", so I stick out like a sore thumb. And there was a lot of very unfriendly stares and texts flying back and forth when we were waiting in the check-in lineup. It was a very interesting experience.
Because they knew who you were by that time. And
they must have Googled, and I think the press
secretary were going to call them out.
I think the press secretary got his knuckles wrapped. Yeah.
But let me follow up on that, because Germany, to me as well, when I look at these issues, particularly around renewables, and it's what I talked about in front of the Senate when I testified before the Energy Natural Resources Committee, it's all about affordability. And that these renewables, wherever they're being implemented, and Germany, of course, is the prime example of this, as is California, that this is incredibly regressive. I mean, did that come up at all among any of these discussions you had with the Germans? Because energy poverty is emerging as a real problem throughout Europe. And one of the European largest trade unions said that they have something like 3 million of their members, 2.7 million, that aren't going to be able to afford to heat their homes this winter. I mean, they're facing a looming crisis. Was this even registering with where they are?
I mean, these are folks from the ministry. Interestingly enough, the German Environment Ministry is called the Ministry of Environment, Conservation, and Nuclear Safety. Like the nuclear bogeyman is so big for them. They've rolled it into that ministry, and you can imagine that it's probably not the friendliest of regulators.
Right.
But I mean, this is a pretty sort of elite, well-heeled group of individuals that I don't think have to worry too much about energy prices. Right. As I did say, he did mention that it has been a really big burden and sacrifice, but one that Germany seems, at least according to him, happy to make. I mean, going there, you get the impression that it's a very wealthy country. And I mean, it's a country that, again, has basically doubled their grid capacity. As you're saying, they use not very much of the capacity of either the wind and solar or the fossil, right? When you put it all together. I mean, he bragged about how, people had said renewable energy would never grow above 5%. And, Portugal has these days where they're 100% powered by wind. But the corollary is in Germany, they do have some days where they're 100% powered by wind and solar. But while I was there, they were 100% coal, gas, and biomass. And that sliver of nuclear, which is about to come offline. So Robert, it really hardened me, I have to say, in terms of how I think about renewables and their impacts on the environment, on the climate, because they're not effective deep decarbonizing tools. Right. They're a huge waste of resources. And, again, having spent a lot of time enmeshed in labor these days, it's terrible for workers. I mean, it's intermittent energy and intermittent jobs, slapping these things up every 20 years and a few maintenance jobs. Not a lot of parking spots outside of a wind farm or a solar farm.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because the way I've thought about it recently, and I'm certain I'm not the first one to put it this way, but that if we're facing a future of more drastic changes in the weather, why would we make our energy and power systems dependent on the weather?
Right.
I mean, that's... and if all the things that I could, arguments I could make about nuclear and the need for that and the need for baseload, and it's partly informed by, as you say, being hardened after these experiences. I had the same after being blacked out here in Austin in February. It was like, well, what is going on here? I mean,
right. It's personal.
We went $66 billion was spent in Texas in the years before the blackouts. And then when crunch time came, it was effectively worth nothing. As I joke, that all that wind and solar went to Cancun with Ted Cruz, not available. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. But you had $200 billion of damage on top of that, right? Think of what that money could have been spent on.
And 700
and lives.
And 700 people dead. Yeah. And many of them not necessarily immediately, from hypothermia, but the knock-on effects of not getting their insulin or not getting to the doctor, not getting to the hospital, not getting to dialysis, whatever it was. But they're still deaths. They're still deaths that were caused by the failure of the electric grid due to a misapprehension of the policymakers to understand what it's about. And that's the part that to me is so deeply dangerous, and how Germany in particular is risking really its future in terms of its viability as an industrial economy. Was there any sense of that in the foreboding and what might be happening?
I mean, it's interesting. I haven't been paying as close attention as I should. I did hear there was a bit of a holdup on the final approval of Nord Stream 2. I mean, they're not going to make the winter without it, especially with the president of Belarus starting to flex muscles and saying, if you're going to impose sanctions on my country, I'm not going to let the gas through. It's going to be a very interesting winter in that regard. But I mean, clearly, Germany, it's building infrastructure to back itself up. It'll keep that coal around. I don't think, when they shut down a nuclear plant in Germany, they vandalized that thing. It's never coming back. They blew up the important stuff. They knocked down the cooling towers, etc. When they decommission a coal plant, I'll be quite honest and certain with you that they're going to be mothballing that thing very gently, because they're probably going to need to call on it again. And that's what we've seen this so far. Just even before the cold of winter, gas has been so expensive that even with really high carbon taxes, it makes more sense to burn coal and just pay the tax. And there's countries that can do it, that can use up all of these famous carbon offset trades for the entire EU, because they got the money, and Germany has it. But on that renewables front, it's just come to a point with me where I will no longer kiss the ring of renewables. there's a temptation to sort of go easy. In so much of the journalism you hear, well, even with skeptics, they'll say, well, we're not there yet, or, we don't have the technology yet. I was asked a question in some of the media coverage I've gotten since this Canadian intervention, a question about nuclear waste. And I said, there are some interesting storage questions out in the world. The question of nuclear waste has been studied very carefully. We have excellent engineers looking at it. It's not a mystery, how to store nuclear waste. What is a mystery is how to store grid scale wind and solar based electricity and fill in intermittency.
Right.
If you want to worry about storage, that is the thing to worry about, because that is, I think for you and I, who have a sense of the scales involved, we have a pretty clear opinion on that. But I think it's really time that folks stop kissing the ring, because this is a form of energy which is just it's harmful, again, to workers, the environment, and ultimately to the climate. You were mentioning, making ourselves dependent on weather-dependent sources. The west of my country in British Columbia has just been wiped out by what's called an atmospheric river. Historic rainfalls and floods that have knocked out highways. The city of Vancouver is cut off. We get most of our Asia Pacific trade lands in Vancouver. And Canada, 90% of our population lives within 100 kilometers of the U.S. border. We have a little railroad that brings everything across. This is devastating, but we're talking a lot about connecting renewables projects with high voltage DC lines. A bunch of those came down as well in these floods. It's insanity. If our world is getting more unstable, and we're going to have more and more natural disasters and floods and things like that, we need to be thinking with a mind of making really robust infrastructure if we want people to get through this and minimize casualties as a result of these increasingly extreme events.
I like the way you put that, Chris. I'm in total agreement. This loss on the understandings of the needs for resilience, right?
Yes.
And what's become clear here in ERCOT in Texas is that the black start units that were going to be needed if the grid had actually failed, many of them weren't even able to do that job. And so the failure of the grid and the ability for resilient societies. My friend Tom Popick is involved in these issues. It should be of paramount importance, but after being in Washington for a couple of days, it doesn't appear, this week, it doesn't appear to be a high priority. That and one of the Democratic senators popped out, posts this, chart of levelized cost of energy, and the nuclear is so expensive, and there was no question attached to it. He's just making this argument. Well, okay, yeah, but you're not counting on the resilience and reliability of the system, are you? So. So tell me, let's back up for a second, Chris, because we've been almost talking for almost an hour. So you've been expanding the podcast, expanding your ambition for what you're doing, and I think it's great. So what's your goal then? You've said now Decouple Studios. What is the new name? What's the goal? What's the end game here for you?
Fundamentally, this whole journey is about satisfying my curiosity. I'm an endlessly curious person, and I used to hunt. And I really feel like I'm hunting for the truth, and I'm learning from some of the best people out there and shaping my opinions as a result. And that's kind of this fundamental curiosity that drives it. Obviously, I've formed some opinions now throughout this process. And I do want to create resources that are useful within the advocacy community, the energy and nuclear advocacy community. And these are heterodox ideas, and there's decades and decades of misinformation that needs to be reversed. There's a really exciting ecosystem that's growing right from folks like Isabel Bemeke on TikTok, making content which is largely consumed by girls between the ages of 12 and 26. It's about 80% of her audience of millions on TikTok. That are opening up people's minds, making them think a little bit about energy, making them reevaluate nuclear. My podcast is on, a far end of another extreme. It's, long form, 60-minute interviews. It's pretty wonky. We don't define all the terms. So we're trying to create some content that's in that mushy middle that can onboard people and get them thinking about the issues. And so, our first episode is looking at, a big reason we're failing on our climate goals, and is looking at that question of premature nuclear plant closures, Indian Point, and the hypocrisy of the environmental movement. And the second one we just produced at COP again was that tour of Africa, looking at energy poverty and whether that can be considered a climate solution. And, the German pavilion was the site of some very interesting events. One was the launching of a campaign for a nuclear-free EU green taxonomy. But the other was, and this was interesting because we had this South African woman, sort of the star of episode 2 of Decouple Studios. And they were announcing a cooperation agreement with South Africa to replace their coal with renewables. And she took quite a bit of offense to that, to this idea that, you know, this rich country that's predominantly using coal for its grid is going to lecture her country and destabilize and fragilize their grid. You know, and in talking with South Africans, I mean, South Africa, in terms of the way their grid network is set up, the surrounding countries really rely on South Africa. It's a much more developed country. So if their grid starts crashing more, and they already do a lot of load shedding, that has impacts far beyond South Africa. So, you know, we're looking to explore a lot of issues in a more nuanced way, and a more, you know, entertaining video format, which hopefully will then hook people and move them on towards the podcast. And it's just kind of fun to now call ourselves, you know, Decouple Media, and have a few different kind of enterprises under that. It's a bit of bluffing, but, you know, you got to fake it till you make it.
So, and that content the people can find on YouTube on Decouple Studios. Is that where they'll find it on YouTube?
Just the Decouple channel on YouTube.
The Decouple channel on YouTube. Okay.
And eventually we'll fight the power and get our ability to advertise and hopefully grow that distribution. We put a lot of it up on Twitter as well. Like we'll cut a 2-minute, 19-second trailer for it, and then direct people to YouTube from there. But we're working on other distribution platforms.
Right. Got it. So I'm just curious now, you've been at the podcast. We started somewhat around the same time. What have you learned in doing this?
Oh my goodness. Where to start? Yeah, we're just shy of 100 episodes and 100,000 downloads. That should be happening kind of within the next 2 weeks or so. I mean, I think part of it is just to always be thinking about where I'm at on the Dunning-Kruger curve. Because it's easy
on the what curve? I'm sorry.
The Dunning-Kruger curve.
What is that? I don't know what that is.
So I mean, it's this idea that I think it was based on a study of college students, but your idea about your sense of how much you know has a lot to do with sort of how much you know about a topic. So at the very beginning, you know, you realize you don't know anything, and then you study it a little bit, and it's very easy to overestimate what you know about that topic and become overly confident, right? Yeah. And there's a hill and then a plateau afterwards, and then with true expertise, you start to have a more accurate understanding of your sense of mastery of a subject
that you don't know.
So there's a danger. I mean, I'm an emergency medicine doctor. I get to speak with, you know, some of the smartest people in the world on my podcast, and that's a real joy. But you know, I guess just trying to always be humble, always have a beginner's mind, and always, I guess, make that assumption. Shit, maybe I'm at this part of the Dunning-Kruger curve, and I need to reevaluate my positions. Because hey, I mean, we're human beings. It's easy to form opinions, but I think it's important to be flexible in those. And so, you know, I've taken and developed certain editorial lines, been very influenced by my guests. I am trying, I think, to also include some heterodox opinions that conflict with mine and entertain a bit of cognitive dissonance. I did have the head of the Indigenous Climate Action Network. I did an interview with her at COP. You know, not someone I agree with on much, but I thought an important voice. Her family, they were displaced from their trap line apparently by one of the big uranium mines. So I felt it was important to have that voice on, and I'm just looking forward to staying fresh and keeping that beginner's mind, and just ultimately, you know, continuing to have fun with this.
Sure. Well, that rhymes with kind of how what's my hurdle for my guess? Do I think they're interesting? That's really my only, you know, am I going to learn something here? Do I think they're interesting? And if that's it, then that's it. Well, then fine. We'll have you on the podcast. Okay. So, you know, my last 2 questions, I'll pose them to you again. You were on the podcast several months ago. So what are you reading now? What's the latest thing on your bookshelf?
Yeah, so I was on a plane, so I did actually force myself to read. I'm reading a book by Mark P. Mills called The Cloud. It's got a long subtitle, but about unleashing the kind of roaring 20s of the 21st century. And it's a very interesting book. I tend to shy away from sort of futurology books, but the information system is not something I know a lot about. So it's a pretty fascinating read. And I think, a very interesting history of technology, the kind of cycles that lead to the discovery, you know, the first prototypes and the spread of technologies. Anyway, it's a great book. I'm enjoying that a lot. And your second question is probably going to be about hope, isn't that right?
Yeah, that's right.
I listen to a lot of your podcasts. Yeah.
And I guess,
You know what?
and how is that, and how's that changed, or has it changed after being in Glasgow and Berlin?
Right. I mean, when you answer a question about hope with a sigh, I mean, that's a little bit telling. Um, I'm possibly going to be working on a project that's directed towards youth, looking at kind of like a career advice book for people that are concerned about climate. And it's going to have a real focus on this idea of empowerment, getting educated. Go ahead and have a strike on Friday, but for God's sakes, hit the books on Saturday, because we're going to need people. We're seeing, like in BC or whatever, we're locked into 2 to 3 degrees. There's going to be big challenges with that. We're going to need some really smart and skilled people in order to meet those. So I think what gives me hope is this idea of the youth becoming inspired and educated and empowered instead of kind of cowering in climate anxiety.
I like that. Yeah, I think we have plenty of other anxiety to go around, and we don't necessarily need to add that climate anxiety to it. Well, Chris, that's been great. We've been chatting for about an hour, so I'll let you go to your next meeting. But my guest has been Dr. Chris Keefer. He's the director of Doctors for Nuclear Energy. You can find that doctorsfornuclearenergy.org, or the Decouple podcast.org, or on YouTube, Decouple channel. Have I got them all there yet, Chris?
Yeah, that's most of them, but yeah, you're very generous.
Man of many hats and many channels. Well, Chris, thanks a million for being on the podcast. I sure appreciate it. And to all of you out in podcast land, tune in for the next episode of the Power Hungry Podcast. Until then, see ya.